Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of sources, research, and history and pull out the singular moments that define the future, often in ways that remain secret for decades.
Right.
We aren't just summarizing history. We were looking for the invisible hinges upon which the world turned.
And today, that hinge is incredibly small, but its weight is, well, it's immense.
It really is.
We are diving deep into a single, terrifying 5-minute window that occurred, 62 years ago during the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Yeah.
This moment was so tense, so volatile, that the survival of global civilization literally hinged on the moral clarity of one man and the bizarre luck of a Soviet institutional policy.
That's so right. We often talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962, as this ultimate political and diplomatic showdown between Kennedy and Khrushchev.
The big chess match.
Exactly. But our sources today, they pull us far away from the White House Situation Room and the Kremlin.
A long way away.
They transport us thousands of miles away, deep underwater into international waters near Cuba, where diplomacy had it had completely broken down and military doctrine took over.
And if 1962 was the high point of the Cold War, the absolute peak of tension, paranoia, and the threat of mutually assured destruction,
Which it was.
then October 27th was the day where the dam didn't just nearly burst, the foundational concrete actually cracked.
Okay, let's unpack this and really establish the setting for everyone.
Let's do it.
President Kennedy had announced the naval quarantine around Cuba on October 22nd. This was a measure intended to stop Soviet ships from delivering more offensive weapons.
Right, a quarantine, which is, a very polite term for a massive blockade.
It's a blockade, yeah.
And it immediately set the stage for a military confrontation. You had U.S. destroyers and Soviet submarines already operating in the exact same patch of water.
And the specific confrontation we are dissecting today involves a Soviet vessel, a Foxtrot-class submarine designated the B-59.
And here's the shocking reality we have to confront right at the top. The decision to unleash a nuclear weapon from this submarine, it didn't rest with Moscow. It wasn't Khrushchev's call.
No.
It was entirely on 3 men, submerged in the Caribbean, completely cut off from any external guidance.
This isn't just some dramatic anecdote. This is, by most accounts, the definitive near catastrophe of the Cold War. And to really grasp the stakes, we first have to understand the devastating capability they had on board.
Absolutely. The B-59 was armed with a single crucial weapon, a T-5 nuclear torpedo.
And this wasn't a standard conventional weapon. We need to be very clear about that.
Not at all. We are talking about a weapon with a yield of 10 kilotons.
A 10-kiloton yield. Just to ground that number in reality for you, that is approximately 2/3 the destructive power of the atomic bomb the United States dropped on Hiroshima in 1945.
So it's a world-ending weapon in a tactical package.
Precisely.
Had Captain Valentin Savitsky received consent and launched that torpedo, say, at the U.S. Navy Surface Fleet, maybe targeting the aircraft carrier USS Randolph,
Which was right there.
it would have instantly vaporized every vessel in the immediate vicinity. That single explosion would have been the first confirmed use of a nuclear weapon since World War II.
And the reaction from the United States would have been, well, instantaneous and catastrophic.
No question.
They would have recognized a nuclear exchange had begun, regardless of the tactical nature of the weapon, and the likely result would be the immediate implementation of a full-scale retaliation against the Soviet Union.
Escalating instantly to thermonuclear war.
Yeah.
This is why historians, they consistently identify this precise 5-minute window as the closest the world has ever come to global thermonuclear war.
But here is the critical historical accident, the thing that provided that razor-thin margin of safety.
The Soviet command structure aboard the submarine.
It was a policy decision, a bizarrely effective failsafe hidden deep within the Soviet system. The launch of that T-5 torpedo required the unanimous consent of 3 senior officers aboard the B-59.
3 checks. 3 separate human beings. All of them had to agree.
So let's introduce the actors in this underwater drama. Well,
Yeah.
first we have the man issuing the order under extreme duress, the captain of the submarine, Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky.
Savitsky. He was the operational commander, the man responsible for the ship and the safety of his crew.
Right.
Second, the political officer, Ivan Semyonovich
Maslennikov.
His job was mainly ideological compliance, but functionally, his consent was mandated for a nuclear launch, a necessary second layer.
And finally, the man who ultimately cast the dissenting vote, the chief of staff of the entire submarine flotilla, who just happened to be riding on the B-59.
Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov.
Arkhipov.
His presence was crucial, not just as a third vote, but because of his seniority.
The fact that they needed 3 sign-offs, I mean, that's the whole story right there.
It is. 2 of the men were reportedly ready to launch. Arkhipov was the one who refused. He literally stood against the end of the world.
So our deep dive mission today is to place you, the listener, right into that steel tube to understand the forces that built up to that moment.
Yeah.
We're about to witness the moment where institutional design, this peculiar 3-man rule, collided violently with pure, raw human instinct and the psychological devastation of environmental stress.
This is the story of how Vasily Arkhipov vetoed Armageddon.
So the immense pressure that ultimately broke Captain Savitsky, it didn't just appear out of nowhere.
No, not at all. It was the product of weeks of isolation and, frankly, physical torture.
The mission started long before the crisis exploded on the global stage. It originated with what the Soviets called Operation Anadyr.
Operation Anadyr was this massive secret deployment of Soviet military assets to Cuba. It included the medium-range ballistic missiles that kicked off the crisis in the first place.
Right, the missiles everyone knows about.
But as part of this highly classified operation, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines, including the B-59, were sent thousands of miles across the Atlantic to the Caribbean.
And these submarines departed from the Kola Peninsula, so way up in the high Arctic on October 1st, 1962.
It was a long, harrowing, and strategically complex journey into tropical waters that these subs were they were fundamentally not designed for.
And that context of naval operations is so important here. These Foxtrot-class subs were specifically designed to be isolated hunter-killers.
Exactly. They were built for long periods of silence, which means they were purposefully out of contact with Moscow for weeks at a time.
So by October 27th, the crew of B-59 had been cut off for weeks. They had absolutely no idea about the frantic diplomatic negotiations happening between Kennedy and Khrushchev.
None. They didn't know the refined rules of engagement, and they certainly didn't know the true intentions of the U.S. Navy when it came to the quarantine.
They were just operating on old intelligence and their own heightened paranoia.
And then, on that exact day, October 27th, external reality seemed to validate all their worst fears.
A U.S. U-2 spy plane, piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, was shot down over Cuba by Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles.
That event changed everything above the surface. To leaders in Washington and Moscow, this single act looked like an undeniable escalation.
Like the beginning of World War III.
Yes. And for the submerged Soviet sailors, the logical progression was crystal clear. If they are shooting down our planes, they will immediately start sinking our submarines. The war has started.
But the conditions the men inside that submarine were enduring, long before the U-2 was even shot down, had already compromised their ability to make rational decisions.
The sources paint a truly agonizing picture of the environment inside B-59. It was a literal psychological pressure cooker.
And we know this from firsthand accounts.
We do. We rely heavily here on the recollections of communications officer Vadim Orlov. His account was finally published in 2002.
And what did he describe?
Orlov vividly described the environment once B-59 was forced to operate submerged in the tropical heat of the Caribbean. He basically described systematic torture.
He detailed conditions of extreme duress that are almost impossible for us to imagine today. These subs were optimized for the cold, frigid North Sea.
Right. And now they're operating in deep, warm water. The engine compartments, the battery rooms, the torpedo storage areas, they all became literal ovens.
Orlov reports the internal temperature soared to levels that were nearly unbearable.
Well over 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Even higher in the engine rooms.
And they couldn't run cooling systems effectively. Why? Because of the noise.
Exactly. The noise would give away their position to the overwhelming American search forces on the surface.
Yeah.
So they just had to suffer in silence and heat.
And compounding that searing heat was the air quality.
Yeah. The sources confirmed the systems designed to scrub the air, the CO2 absorbers, they were failing. They were severely overloaded.
So you have dangerously high levels of carbon dioxide accumulating inside this cramped steel tube.
And this is where the physical reality ties directly to the catastrophic decision-making process. High CO2 levels don't just give you a headache.
Yeah.
They induce a state of physical and psychological impairment. Think about the symptoms. Shortness of breath, lethargy, increased heart rate, and critically, impaired judgment, confusion, tunnel vision, and aggressive behavior.
So they weren't just physically uncomfortable, they were chemically compromised.
Completely. They were exhausted, oxygen-deprived, and psychologically on edge, convinced by their isolation and the mounting evidence that war had already erupted. They were primed for a panic reaction.
And Orlov confirms this, right? This pervasive psychological state.
Oh, absolutely. He said the overwhelming shared belief among the crew was that they were already fighting World War III. They weren't waiting for confirmation of an attack. They were waiting for the inevitable American blow, ready to strike first before they were sunk.
This background of physical and psychological compromise is so essential. It's really the only way to understand why Captain Savitsky reacted so aggressively.
They were pushed to the absolute breaking point of human endurance. It guaranteed they would be hyperreactive, impulsive, and unable to think clearly when the Americans finally showed up.
So the stage is set. The crew is stewing in this cocktail of heat, high CO2, and paranoia thousands of miles from the truth. And now they are located and cornered by the overwhelming force of the U.S. Navy.
This encounter was absolutely intentional. The U.S. Navy was implementing aggressive anti-submarine warfare tactics to enforce the quarantine. They were actively hunting Soviet vessels.
Our sources detail the precise American assets involved here. B-59 was located and aggressively cornered by an overwhelmingly powerful force.
11 U.S. Navy destroyers,
11.
accompanied by the massive aircraft carrier USS Randolph. That is a massive amount of sonar and firepower against one single struggling conventional submarine.
For the B-59 crew, this was not just a threat, it was a death sentence.
There was no realistic chance of escape from a force that large. But here's the critical point of international and operational confusion. This is the moment Cold War miscommunication nearly caused the apocalypse.
Right, we have to address the clash between the U.S. intention and the Soviet perception of those intentions. The gap between those two realities is what made the whole crisis so fragile.
So according to the U.S. Navy deck logs, the official American records, the goal was not immediate destruction. The U.S. Navy was dropping non-lethal signaling depth charges.
Signaling depth charges. That phrase required some careful explanation. What exactly was the U.S. protocol here?
The U.S. Navy was following what they believed to be standard procedure for enforcing a quarantine. They wanted B-59 to surface for identification, per the blockade rules.
So they dropped these charges, which were small, non-lethal explosives, to signal to the submerged crew, hey, we've found you, surface immediately.
They were aggressive, yes, but they were not meant to kill.
But the Soviet crew didn't receive a diplomatic signal, they heard explosions.
Exactly. Cut off, isolated, terrified, and psychologically compromised by the CO2, they interpreted those charges, which would have sounded exactly like real ordnance going off nearby, as a direct and lethal military attack.
They believed they were being depth charged for destruction.
To Captain Valentin Savitsky, the sinking of the B-59 was imminent. He knew they couldn't escape the massive American force.
So under this immense duress, believing his ship was seconds from being destroyed and his country was at war, his entire military training just kicked in.
He made the immediate, instinctual decision to retaliate with the only weapon he possessed that could make a difference.
Vadim Orlov's recollections here are just. They're crucial. They provide this visceral, frontline account of the chaos.
Orlov describes Savitsky's shock, his absolute fury, and his immediate move to the highest possible level of aggression when those charges started dropping right on top of him.
The captain wasn't just reacting to a military situation, he was reacting to what he perceived as the ultimate violation, the launch of World War III.
And he immediately gave the order to prepare and arm the nuclear torpedo.
And Orlov relayed Savitsky's alleged chilling quote, which just encapsulates the Soviet military mindset of suicidal honor and vengeance.
We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy.
Wow.
That phrase, it speaks volumes about the Soviet commitment to honor, retaliation, and self-sacrifice.
It's a powerful narrative, but it also demonstrates a complete breakdown of rational strategic thinking.
Oh, it's driven purely by panic and doctrine.
Yeah.
The logic was, if we're going to die, we must ensure we take them with us, regardless of the consequences for the rest of the world.
And this is the moment. This is where that unique, peculiar, and ultimately world-saving three-man rule slammed on the brakes.
Savitsky gave the order to prepare the launch, and the 2 required votes besides his own were needed.
And Savitsky was ready. Political officer Maslenikov was reportedly ready to launch as well.
So they had a 2-to-1 consensus in favor of launching a nuclear counterstrike based on the immediate evidence. The weight of panic and doctrine was overwhelmingly in favor of launch.
And this brings us to the most chaotic, most fragile 5 minutes in modern history. The conning tower of the B-59 full of steam, CO2, shouting, panicked men. It became the site of a physical and verbal screaming match that prevented the end of civilization.
The sources confirm the argument was heated, desperate. While the exact duration is hard to verify, eyewitness accounts confirm the high intensity of the struggle between the three officers. The pressure wasn't just external, it was internal.
And we focus now on Vasily Alexandrovich Arkhipov. His position was absolutely critical here.
He wasn't just a third officer, he was the chief of staff of the entire 69th Submarine Brigade.
Which means he was technically the highest-ranking officer of the flotilla, even though he was acting as the executive officer on B-59.
Right. And that seniority gave his dissenting voice immense authority. Perhaps enough to physically override the captain, but certainly enough to give his no insurmountable weight.
And he refused to give his consent. He vetoed the nuclear launch. He broke the chain of retaliation before it could even leave the tube.
This refusal is the absolute core of the story, and we need to spend some time synthesizing why he hesitated.
Yeah, because every protocol, every alarm, every ounce of military honor that drove Savitsky suggested immediate retaliation. Why did Arkhipov, under the same extreme duress, exercise caution?
His own 1997 recollection, along with analysis of his career, suggests his decision stemmed from a profound recognition of the chaotic circumstances.
He was maybe a bit removed from the immediate panic of just that one submarine's crew.
I think so. Arkhipov, being the senior flotilla commander, was perhaps more accustomed to broader strategic thinking. It was looking at the bigger picture.
So he was the clearest thinker in the room, or at least the least affected by the psychological compromise from the CO2 and heat.
It seems that way. He looked at the chaos, the unreliable signals, the physical distress of the crew, and he fundamentally questioned the nature of the attack.
He paused.
He paused and asked the crucial question. Would a real overwhelming American first strike start with these small, random explosions around one submarine?
Or were they just trying to force them to the surface?
Exactly. He chose rational skepticism and caution over the immediate, automated, instinctual panic that Soviet doctrine demanded.
This is the difference between a system designed for automatic retaliation and the intervention of critical human thought. But it's a deeply misunderstood moment, one we have to clarify for everyone.
Yes, the common misconception is that Arkhipov single-handedly committed this massive act of insubordination by defying a direct, confirmed launch order.
Which makes him a Hollywood hero, but it's not quite accurate.
It's not. It inaccurately portrays the institutional mechanism that actually saved us.
So what's the correct reality?
The correct reality is far more subtle and far more terrifying in its implication. He simply withheld the required unanimous consent.
He didn't commit a massive act of insubordination by saying no to a confirmed launch.
He upheld a very specific mandated rule. All three men must agree.
Without his final vote, the nuclear launch was impossible under Soviet protocol.
So it wasn't Arkhipov rebelling against the chain of command. It was the chain of command working exactly as intended because of that built-in requirement for consensus.
And because one individual had the clarity of mind, or perhaps the seniority, to refuse that consensus.
It's the ultimate example of institutional design succeeding through human intervention, not through automation.
And this quiet, submerged moment in the conning tower, it provides an incredible window into the true fragility of the Cold War system, which historians have focused on ever since.
Yeah, historian Martin Sherwin, particularly in his work Gambling with Armageddon, is adamant that the world avoided nuclear war not through superior statesmanship or perfect military control.
But through what?
Through plain dumb luck and the sheer chance of individual action.
That's a powerful thesis. He's arguing that the complex, redundant systems designed to prevent accidental war were actually failing in that moment.
And that the human factor, Arkhipov's hesitation, was the only thing that overruled the automatic systems and the protocols designed for immediate mutual retaliation. Sherwin demonstrates how easily nuclear weapons create this hair-trigger environment that demands, counterintuitively, personal doubt and even insubordination to survive.
The protocol dictated that if they were under attack, they should launch the nuke.
Right. But the mechanism that saved us was a combination of that unique three-man consensus rule and one individual's ability to question the automated logic of fear.
And historian Michael Dobbs, in 1 Minute to Midnight, he reinforces this idea, right? By highlighting the profound loss of control by the leaders in Washington and Moscow.
Dobbs's research is fantastic on this. He emphasizes that the events unfolding on the periphery at sea, on land in Cuba, and in this case 100 meters under the sea, were often entirely unknown to Kennedy and Khrushchev.
They were negotiating the grand geopolitical chess match.
while operational military units were making life-or-death decisions in total isolation.
So the world's fate was resting not in the hands of sophisticated negotiators, but in the hands of three exhausted, oxygen-deprived men thousands of miles away who thought their submarine was about to be destroyed.
It fundamentally underscores how easily the conflict could have escalated beyond diplomatic control, simply through procedural confusion and human panic.
The fragility thesis, then.
The fragility thesis, drawn from all this scholarly work, states that the crisis was intensely human, chaotic, and characterized by rampant miscommunication. It was not a perfectly controlled game of chess. And Arkhipov's intervention simply demonstrates the sheer randomness of survival when military doctrine meets real-world, messy human experience.
So by refusing to consent, Arkhipov forced Captain Savitsky to face the reality that he just discussed. He couldn't fire the nuclear torpedo, regardless of his fury.
Which meant Savitsky was left with only one viable option.
Surface the submarine.
Surface the submarine to escape the relentless signaling charges.
And surfacing D-59 was the pivotal act that ended the immediate threat.
Once they surfaced, they were out of the danger zone, and critically, they were able to reestablish communication links. They could finally confirm the war had not officially begun between the superpowers.
This quiet, submerged act of defiance allowed the high-stakes diplomacy between Kennedy and Khrushchev to continue uninterrupted by an actual nuclear exchange.
And those diplomatic efforts, thankfully, moved very quickly toward a resolution.
The timeline is really tight here. The B-59 confrontation happened on October 27th.
And just one day later, October 28, 1962, the U.S. and the Soviet Union reached their final agreement.
The USSR would remove the missile sites in Cuba.
In exchange for the U.S. pledging not to invade the island and, secretly, agreeing to remove U.S. missiles from Turkey, the immediate crisis was averted.
But focusing only on the B-59 incident, it often overshadows a broader and equally terrifying reality. This wasn't the only near miss.
Not even close.
It was just the one where the human failsafe happened to work.
That's right. The common misconception is that B-59 was a unique, isolated incident. But the sources confirm that at least 3 other Soviet submarines, B-36, B-4, and B-130,
were also carrying nuclear torpedoes.
and were similarly forced to surface by aggressive U.S. Navy anti-submarine forces during the crisis.
So, Arkhipov's decision was unique because of the internal confrontation about the launch. But the precarious situation, Soviet subs with tactical nukes being cornered by U.S. destroyers, that was actually the norm during the crisis.
It was the ubiquity of peril. It was happening all over the Caribbean, which really gives the lie to the idea that the leaders had things under control.
It was a system ripe with failure points.
We just happen to have the most detailed, chilling, and ultimately hopeful eyewitness accounts from the B-59. It's a crucial reminder that our fate was being decided simultaneously at multiple flashpoints, with multiple individuals facing the same pressure to retaliate automatically.
Now let's look at Arkhipov himself for a moment. His story wasn't widely known until the early 2000s, but he did make a public statement years earlier, in 1997, at a conference in Moscow.
Right, and his self-assessment is remarkably modest, even dismissive of the sensationalism that later followed.
In that statement, he recounted the extreme duress and the aggressive actions of the U.S. forces.
But he downplayed his own heroic role. He insisted he merely upheld protocol and expressed frustration with how the event was later sensationalized. He just recounted the facts as he saw them under extreme pressure.
Highlighting the inherent danger of their isolation.
Exactly. He didn't seek the spotlight. He sought to articulate the terrifying scenario they faced, using a chilling thought experiment that really encapsulated the whole problem of automated warfare.
He gave us this quote, which is maybe the most profound encapsulation of the decision-making chaos they faced.
The commander could have instinctively, without contemplation, ordered an emergency dive. Then, after submerging, the question whether the plane was shooting at the submarine or around it would not have come up in anybody's head. That is war.
That is war. A decision made instinctively, without contemplation, under duress, escalating a confrontation based on a sound, a feeling, or a momentary chemically induced belief that they were already being sunk.
The stakes weren't strategic, they were primal.
And that quote perfectly summarizes the fragility thesis, doesn't it?
It does. Our survival, historically, was not guaranteed by grand treaties or a sophisticated geopolitical strategy, or even by communication channels that worked perfectly.
No.
It was guaranteed by the required consensus inside that hot steel hull and by one individual's calm refusal to surrender, to panic, and automated retaliation.
It was one man, Arkhipov, standing firm against the unanimous electronic verdict and the immense human pressure of the moment.
He possessed the critical thinking required to doubt the system, something his commanding officer, under that immense pressure, had lost.
In this deep dive, it reveals that history is fundamentally built on the foundation of what was narrowly prevented, not just what actually occurred.
The failure to launch the B-59's nuclear torpedo is perhaps the most significant non-event of the 20th century.
Yeah.
It proves that technological fail-safes are only as good as the critical thinking of the human beings operating them.
So we have to remember the crucial numbers that defined this near apocalypse.
Yeah.
A 10-kiloton yield weapon.
The 3 required votes to launch it.
And the 11 destroyers cornering the submarine in a move the U.S. thought was signaling, but the Soviets viewed as war.
The fail-safe was not technology or policy in the abstract. It was the required consensus of those 3 men and the refusal of the chief of staff, the man of highest rank and perhaps greatest clarity, to grant that consent.
That's the point. That's where the world was saved.
That's it.
So if this pivotal moment which prevented global nuclear war remained largely unknown for decades, only emerging into public consciousness in the 2000s, what other near-miss decisions or invisible hinges is our complex, interconnected world turning on right now?
Every system we rely on, from finance to nuclear deterrence, involves automated responses and moments of necessary human override.
Yeah.
Archipov's story forces us to ask, are we preparing our human operators to challenge the system when the data screams for destruction? Or are we relying too heavily on automation?
We are all living in the world saved by Vasily Arkhipov. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back next time to explore another moment that changed everything.